November 22nd, 1910, a rail yard in Hoboken, New Jersey. Almost midnight. A private railroad car sits at the end of the platform, its blinds drawn, its lights low. One by one, men arrive out of the dark. They come separately. They do not greet each other by name. They have been ordered not to. One of them carries a borrowed shotgun he has no idea how to use. Because if anyone asks, and reporters will ask, the story is simple. They are going duck hunting. The men boarding that car run the largest banks in America. Together, the institutions they command control a staggering share of the country's money, and by some later claims, a quarter of the wealth of the entire world. We're going to test that claim before this story is over. For 9 days, they will vanish onto a private island off the coast of Georgia, and in a clubhouse dining room with the doors closed and the servants kept at a distance, they will design a machine. You live inside that machine today. It sets the price of your mortgage. It decides what your savings are worth. It is called the Federal Reserve, and this, the secret meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910, is where it was born. Here is the strangest part. For the next 20 years, every man on that train denied the meeting ever happened. Then, in 1935, one of them confessed, in print, in a national magazine. Frank Vanderlip, president of what is now Citibank, admitted that he had traveled to Jekyll Island as secretly as a conspirator, and that if the public had discovered what they were doing, the plan would have been dead on arrival. A real secret meeting, a real cover story, a real confession. You don't need to invent a conspiracy here. The documented truth is strange enough. But myth grew over this island anyway, thicker than the Spanish moss on its oaks. You may have heard some of it. That bankers own the Federal Reserve, that it's a private company, that the Titanic was sunk to silence the men who opposed it, that behind it all, one family pulls the strings, a family whose story we told in our last episode. So, as always on this channel, we're going to do the work. We will separate what is documented, what is exaggerated, and what is invented. In the last episode, Fortuna's wheel turned through Europe. 5 brothers, 1 family, and the discovery that credit wins wars. That story ended with a promise, a new kind of financial power about to be born on the other side of the Atlantic. This is that story. This is Fortuna's wheel, and the wheel now turns west. The panic. To understand why 7 men snuck onto a train in 1910, you have to stand in a crowd on a New York sidewalk 3 years earlier, watching your life savings disappear through a locked bronze door. October 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest banks in New York, marble columns, a fortress of respectability, and a line of depositors stretching down Fifth Avenue, growing by the hour. The trouble started with greed, as it usually does. A pair of speculators had tried to corner the market in copper. They failed. But their scheme was tangled up with banks, and when it collapsed, depositors started asking a terrifying question: is my bank tangled up with them too? Fear doesn't need to be right, it only needs to be contagious. Put names on that greed because the chain of dominoes is documented link by link. The scheme belonged to the Heinze brothers, coppermen from Montana, and their partner Charles Morse, a serial manipulator the newspapers loved. In mid-October, Otto Heinze launched the corner on United Copper's stock. It broke in a single afternoon. The brokerage collapsed. The banks the Heinzes and Morse controlled were suddenly radioactive, and depositors began working out correctly that respectable institutions had lent into the scheme. The most respectable of them all was the Knickerbocker, because its president, Charles Barney, was connected to Morse's circle. The connection alone was enough, and here the panic collected its first human life. Barney, forced out of his own bank, shunned by the men who had dined at his table, shot himself that November. The newspapers, with the cruelty of the age, debated whether his depositors would be paid before his family. Fear doesn't need to be right. It only needs a body to point at. The Knickerbocker paid out $8 million in under 3 hours. Then it stopped paying. The doors closed. And the panic of 1907, jumped from bank to bank like fire down a dry street. Here is what made 1907 different from every panic before it. There was no central bank in America, no lender of last resort, no institution whose job it was to stand behind the system. There was only one man, John Pierpont Morgan, 70 years old, half retired, furious at being interrupted. Morgan summoned the presidents of New York's banks to his private library on Madison Avenue, a marble palace built to hold his art. He put them in a room, and by several accounts, he locked the door and kept the key in his pocket while they argued through the night about who would put up money to stop the bleeding. Think about what that means. The financial system of the richest country on earth came down to one old man deciding, bank by bank, who deserved to live and who would be allowed to die. When the stock exchange nearly failed, Morgan raised $25 million in minutes. When the city of New York itself couldn't pay its bills, Morgan bought its bonds. The week that followed reads like a fever chart. Call money, overnight loans to the stock market, spiked past 100% interest when it could be had at all. Trust company after trust company wobbled. The Treasury Secretary, George Cortelyou, rushed to New York and deposited millions of government money into the banks, the state, hat in hand, begging private men to hold the line, and the private men made theater of it. John D. Rockefeller, the richest human being alive, telephoned the Associated Press to announce he would pledge half of everything he owned to maintain America's credit. Whether he was ever called on to do it mattered less than the headline. Panic is a disease of belief, and belief needed a bigger name than the government's. For 2 weeks, Morgan's library on Madison Avenue functioned as the actual central bank of the United States, a 70-year-old collector deciding between Renaissance manuscripts which institutions opened their doors in the morning. The panic burned out, the system survived, but everyone who watched it happen understood the same cold arithmetic. America had been saved by the judgment, the reputation, and the personal will of a single 70-year-old man, and 70-year-old men do not last. Congress asked the question out loud, what happens next time when there is no Morgan? That question is the reason Jekyll Island happened, but before we board the train, we need to do what this channel always does. We need to draw the line between record and myth. Myth and record. No institution in American life attracts more suspicion than the Federal Reserve, except perhaps the family from our last episode. And it's no accident that the two myths are usually told together. You've heard the claims. The Fed is a private corporation owned by bankers hiding in plain sight. Its creation was a coup against democracy, rammed through an empty Congress at Christmas. The income tax arrived the same year, the same hand, the same plan. The Titanic was sunk in 1912 to drown the three rich men who stood in the way, and behind it all, Rothschild. Some of what you just heard is documented fact. Some of it is a real fact, inflated until its shape is wrong. And some of it is pure invention with a body count of its own, as we saw in episode 1. Our method in this episode is the same as always. Primary sources first. Frank Vanderlip's own printed confession from 1935, the papers of Senator Nelson Aldrich, Paul Warburg's memoirs, the congressional record, including the actual roll call votes with names and numbers, because one of the most popular claims about the Fed dies the moment you count them. Where the record is thin, we'll say so. Where historians disagree, we'll show you the disagreement instead of hiding it. And here's the promise, the verified story, the one the participants themselves admitted to, involves fake names, a borrowed shotgun, a millionaire's hunting club, and 9 days of secrecy that its architects defended decades later as absolutely necessary. You do not need to add a single invented detail for this to be one of the strangest true stories in American history. But to understand why grown men, senators, bank presidents, felt they had to sneak around like criminals just to discuss a central bank, you need to understand something about America itself. This was a country that had already built a central bank twice, and killed it twice. The country that killed its banks. Most nations fear having no one in charge of their money. America feared the opposite. The first Bank of the United States was Alexander Hamilton's creation, chartered in 1791, and from the day it opened, half the country saw it as a monster, a tool for merchants and moneymen, unaccountable to the farmer and the frontier. When its charter came up for renewal in 1811, Congress let it die. Then came the second bank, and the second bank made an enemy no bank should ever make, Andrew Jackson, President General Duelist, a man who counted grudges the way bankers count interest, and who believed in his bones that a central bank was corruption given a marble building. The bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, forced a confrontation, pushing the charter renewal early in an election year, betting Jackson wouldn't dare veto it. Jackson dared. His veto message in 1832 is one of the most famous documents in American politics, a declaration that the government would not stand godfather to a private money power. He told an ally in words that became legend that the bank was trying to kill him, but that he would kill it first. He did. The charter expired in 1836, and for the next 77 years, the United States, soon the largest economy on Earth, operated with no central bank at all. Understand what that meant in practice. The money supply couldn't flex. Every autumn, when farmers needed cash to move the harvest, credit tightened across the whole country like a belt pulled 2 notches too far. Reserves stacked up in New York pyramided into the stock market, and when confidence cracked anywhere, there was no fire brigade. What filled the vacuum those 77 years was money that would strike you today as barely money at all. Before the Civil War, thousands of private banks issued their own banknotes, paper promising redemption in gold or silver at some counter you would likely never visit. Merchants kept published guides, updated weekly, listing which notes were sound, which traded at a discount and which were outright frauds. Counterfeit detectors were practically a literary genre. A dollar from Georgia was not a dollar in Boston. The Civil War's national banking acts cleaned up the chaos into a single national currency, but bolted it by law to the market for government bonds. The result was a money supply that answered to Washington's debt, not to the economy's pulse. Orderly now, still rigid as iron. So the fires came on schedule: 1857, 1873, a depression so long they called it the Great Depression until a worse one stole the name, 1893, and then 1907. But here is the political trap. Every panic proved the system was broken, and every proposed fix ran into the ghost of Andrew Jackson, into generations of Americans, especially in the South and West, who would rather endure the fires than hand the matches to Wall Street. By 1910, the phrase central bank was so poisonous that no honest bill containing it could pass, which meant that the men who wanted one had exactly two options: give up or build it in disguise. The Old Man's Library. Before the disguise, one more look at the man whose mortality started the clock. By 1907, J.P. Morgan had already rescued the United States government itself, not once, but memorably in 1895, when the Treasury's gold reserves were draining toward empty, and Morgan assembled a private syndicate to refill them. His partner in that syndicate was August Belmont, the American agent of the House of Rothschild. Yes, that house. The wheel from episode 1 was already turning through this story, quietly, a full generation before Jekyll Island. The 1907 rescue in Morgan's library was the old man's masterpiece. Picture the room: Renaissance paintings, manuscripts under glass, a fire burning low, and the most powerful bankers in America, kept there past 4 in the morning because Morgan had decided nobody left until the money was pledged. It worked. That was the problem. Because a system that survives only when a private citizen locks the right men in the right room is not a system. It's a lucky accident wearing a system's clothes. Congress moved while the ashes were still warm. In 1908, it passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, an emergency patch, and created something with a duller name and a sharper purpose: the National Monetary Commission. Its mandate: study the money systems of the world and recommend what America should build. Its chairman was the most powerful legislator of the age, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, a man so central to the machinery of Washington that the press called him the general manager of the nation. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller Jr., his grandson and namesake, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, would one day be Vice President of the United States. Aldrich spent nearly 2 years touring Europe, the Bank of England, the Banque de France, the German Reichsbank, filling volumes with research and coming home converted. Europe's machines worked. America's absence of one did not. But Aldrich had a problem money couldn't solve. He was famous, he was Wall Street's friend, and everyone knew it. Any plan wearing his face was born half dead. What he needed was expertise nobody in Washington had, and a way to use it that nobody in Washington could see. The expertise, it turned out, had already immigrated. The Senator and the Immigrant. Quick pause. If this kind of history is why you're here, the subscribe button is how the wheel keeps turning. One click. Back to 1910. Paul Warburg did not look like a revolutionary. Rimless glasses, careful mustache, the manner of a man who apologizes to furniture. He was born in Hamburg into one of Germany's great banking families, a family whose world was the world we walked through in Episode 1, the tight intermarried aristocracy of European finance, where the Warburgs did business alongside the Rothschilds and everyone knew everyone's balance sheet. His brother Max ran the family bank in Hamburg. Paul married into Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful investment houses in New York, and moved to America in 1902. What he found here horrified him. To a banker trained in Hamburg, the American system wasn't primitive. It was pre-modern, a great industrial power running its money on machinery. Europe had scrapped generations earlier. No elastic currency, no lender of last resort, panics on a metronome. So Warburg did something almost touchingly naive. He wrote essays explaining patiently how a modern reserve system worked and published them. Wall Street's reaction was a shrug, a foreigner telling America to be more like Europe on the subject of banks. He was, in the political language of the day, precisely the wrong messenger with precisely the right message. But one reader took notes. After 1907 turned Warburg's warnings into the evening news, the papers found their way to Senator Aldrich, the one man with the power to act on them, and the one man who couldn't be seen doing it. Picture the alliance forming. Aldrich, American power, poison name. Warburg, no political standing at all and the best monetary mind on the continent. Each man was the other's missing half. Therefore, each man was also the other's greatest liability. A famous Wall Street senator drafting a central bank with a German-born banker from Kuhn Loeb. In public, that plan wouldn't survive a single newspaper morning, so it would not be drafted in public. In the first week of November 1910, a handful of carefully chosen men received a quiet invitation. A private rail car, a southbound journey, bring warm clothes for shooting weather, and leave your last name at home. The train to Jekyll. Now we can board the train from the opening of this story, and this time we know the passengers. Senator Nelson Aldrich, the general manager of the nation, A. Piat Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and the Monetary Commission's economist, Henry Davison, Senior Partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, the old man's ambassador, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, the bank that would become Citibank, Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb, the immigrant with the blueprints in his head, and Benjamin Strong, a rising Morgan man whose name will matter enormously later in the story. One honest note, because this channel promised you honesty, the exact roster varies slightly between sources. Some accounts add a name, some subtract one. What you just heard follows Vanderlip's own confession and the standard histories. Where the record blurs, we say so. The secrecy, though, is not blurry at all. It is documented by the participants themselves. First names only: Nelson, Paul, Frank, Harry, Ben, so the porters and waiters could never testify to a surname. Arrivals staggered at the Hoboken platform, the hunting costumes, the borrowed guns. Vanderlip wrote 25 years later that they were told to leave their last names behind them and that the group traveled with the furtiveness of conspirators. His word, conspirators. Their destination sat off the Georgia coast, wrapped in salt marsh and silence, the the Jekyll Island Club. If you wanted a stage set for the myth of American money, you could not build one better. The club's membership rolls read like a census of the Gilded Age. Morgans, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Astors, Pulitzers. Its own promotional lore boasted that its members represented a sixth of the world's wealth. Flag that number. It's a marketing claim, not an audit. The ancestor of the 1/4 of the world's wealth sat at the table line that gets repeated about this meeting today. Gilded, in every sense. We'll weigh it properly in our accounting chapter. In late November, the club was closed for the season. Empty. Whether that emptiness was lucky timing or arranged convenience depends on which historian you read. But for 9 days, give or take, the most exclusive club in America belonged to 6 or 7 men using first names, eating alone, and working. The journey itself took the better part of 2 days, 1,000 miles south along the coast. The private car switched from train to train, meals taken behind those drawn blinds. From the Georgia mainland, a small boat carried them across the marsh channel to the island landing. What they found was a resort out of season and out of a dream. The turreted clubhouse rising over live oaks strung with Spanish moss, cottages the size of mansions standing empty, a staff reduced to a skeleton crew that knew the guests only as Nelson, Paul, Frank, Harry, Ben. Vanderlip's recollection of the days that followed is not of leisure, it is of work, morning to midnight. Meals taken at the long table where the arguing continued between courses. Warburg, the technician, pushing the pure European design. Aldrich, the politician, pushing back with what the Senate would bear. Davison, the Morgan diplomat, keeping the two from each other's throats. By some accounts, the sharpest fights were not about banking at all, but about what the American ear could be brought to tolerate. Every clause weighed twice, once for soundness, once for how it would sound in Nebraska. Working on what, exactly? On the answer to an impossible riddle, how do you build a central bank for a country that kills central banks? 9 days in November. Strip away the palm trees and the secrecy, and what happened in that clubhouse dining room was 9 days of brutal technical argument. Cigars, cold coffee, and men who ran empires being told their ideas were wrong. They had 4 problems to solve. 1, the currency couldn't breathe. The amount of money in circulation was rigid while the economy's need for it swelled and shrank with the seasons. Every harvest, the country nearly strangled itself. 2, reserves pyramided. Country banks parked money in city banks. City banks parked it in New York. New York lent it to the stock market. A tremor at the top shook every bank in the pyramid. 3, no lender of last resort. When fear arrived, no institution existed whose job was to lend into the storm. That job had a name, and the name was Morgan, and Morgan was mortal. 4, and this was the one that kept them up at night, anything they designed had to survive American politics. The ghost of Andrew Jackson sat at that table like an 8th guest. Warburg's answer to the 4th problem was the masterstroke, and it is the DNA of the system you live under today. Do not build one central bank, build many. A network of regional reserve banks spread across the country, Boston to San Francisco, each serving its own district, so no single city, and especially not New York, could be accused of holding the keys. Above them, a coordinating board. Underneath them, the member banks themselves, holding stock in their regional reserve bank. A European engine wearing American clothes, and that stock, mark this detail because an entire mythology grows from it, was stock like no other. It couldn't be sold. It couldn't be traded. Its dividend was capped. Owning it conferred obligation more than control. We will come back to this when we weigh the claim that bankers own the Fed. The heart of the design deserves 30 seconds of plain English because it still beats today. A merchant sells goods and holds an IOU, solid, short-term, boring. Under the island's plan, his bank could take that IOU to the Reserve Bank and swap it for fresh cash at a small charge. When commerce boomed, more IOUs meant more cash flowing out to meet it. When commerce cooled, the IOUs matured and the cash flowed back and vanished. Money that expanded and contracted with real business, automatically, no committee required. Bankers came to call the mechanism the discount window. The metaphor is exact. A window opened in a wall that in 1907 had been solid brick. The machine they sketched had elastic currency that expanded against sound commercial paper and gold, reserves that could flow to wherever fear broke out, and a structure carefully shaped so the word central need never appear. They called it the Aldrich Plan, the one name they should never have put on it. 9 days, a country's monetary constitution, drafted between duck hunting costumes and dinner. Then the blinds came down on the railcar and the men scattered back into their famous last names. Selling the creature. The plan survived the island, then it met the public and nearly died on contact. In 1911, the proposal surfaced under a respectable name, the National Reserve Association. The press and the progressives took one look at who was carrying it and rendered a verdict that had nothing to do with its mechanics. Aldrich, Wall Street senator, Rockefeller's in-law. The plan's greatest asset on the island, his power, was its death sentence in daylight. And the timing could not have been worse for secrecy's architects because Washington had just started pulling on a thread that unraveled straight toward men like them. A congressional investigation, the Pujo Committee, set out to map what it called the money trust, and what it found electrified the country. A web of interlocking directorships in which a handful of New York men, Morgan's partners chief among them, held seats across dozens upon dozens of banks, railroads, and industrial giants. The committee's lawyer put old J.P. Morgan himself on the stand. The exchange became legend, Morgan insisting that the foundation of credit was not money or property, but character. The public heard something different. The public heard confirmation. A small club really did sit at the center of everything. Into this weather walked the election of 1912, and out of it walked a Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, whose party had been founded in living memory of its mythology on Andrew Jackson's war against the bank. The Aldrich Plan, under that name, was finished. Its ideas were not. A Virginia congressman named Carter Glass, no friend of Wall Street and proud of it, took charge of drafting the Democratic answer. What emerged kept the deep architecture the island had settled on: regional reserve banks, elastic currency, member banks holding that strange, powerless stock. But it grafted on a decisively public head, a board appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Not bankers choosing bankers, a hybrid, private roots, public crown. They called it the Federal Reserve Act. And now a genuinely strange chapter in the story. Several of the island's own alumni attacked it. Aldrich criticized the bill. Vanderlip fought it and pushed a rival plan. Warburg had reservations he documented at length. Later generations would look at that and see theater. Bankers publicly opposing their own creation so the public would trust it. It's a seductive reading. It is also, and we are careful here, an interpretation. What the record documents is the opposition itself. What it does not document is a script behind it. Historians still argue whether those objections were conviction, tactics, or wounded pride. We show you the fork in the record. You get to weigh it. What nobody disputes is what happened in December 1913. The death of the one-man bank. Before the vote, the story pauses for a funeral, and history, which has no obligation to be poetic, chose this moment to be exactly that. In December 1912, the Pujo Committee finally got the old man himself in the witness chair. J.P. Morgan, 75 now, heavy and unwell, facing the committee's relentless counsel under the flash lamps. Asked whether credit was based on money or property, Morgan gave the answer carved into every account of the age. "No, sir. The first thing is character. Money," he said, "could not buy trust from him." The progressives heard arrogance. His partners heard a creed. Either way, the country was looking at something it had never quite seen before. The private central bank of the United States, in the flesh, under oath, and visibly mortal. The hearings drained him. His family said so. His partners said so. Weeks later, he sailed for Europe to recover, wintering up the Nile and then in Rome. He never came home. On the last day of March 1913, John Pierpont Morgan died in his sleep at the Grand Hotel in Rome. Wall Street lowered its flags. The stock exchange closed in his honor, a courtesy normally reserved for presidents. Tributes poured from kings and cardinals. And then came the detail that stunned the men who had feared him. When his estate was tallied, Morgan's personal fortune, his art collection aside, came to roughly $80 million, a colossal sum. And yet, next to the Rockefellers and Carnegies of the world, almost modest. John D. Rockefeller, reading the figure, is said to have marveled that Morgan hadn't even been a rich man. He hadn't needed to be. That was the whole point, and the whole problem. Morgan's power had never really been his money. It was his word, the willingness of every other banker to follow when he moved, a currency of pure character, exactly as he testified. And currencies of character die with the character. 8 months after Rome, the Federal Reserve Act passed. The timing was coincidence. The bill was coming regardless. But step back and look at what the calendar did. In a single year, 1913, America buried the man who had been its central bank and chartered the machine that would replace him. The one-man system and its successor passed each other at the door. 2 days before Christmas. Before this chapter, a question for you. Of all the claims you've heard about the Fed's creation, which one did you believe? Tell us in the comments. The answers shape future episodes. Now, December 1913. The claim goes like this. The Federal Reserve Act was snuck through a sleeping Congress 2 days before Christmas, when the chambers stood empty and the members were home trimming trees. It's a perfect story, sinister, seasonal, repeatable. Now count the votes. The House passed the final bill 298 to 60. The Senate followed with 43 yeas against 25 nays. Those are not the numbers of an empty room. They are the numbers of a Congress that had fought over this bill through an entire autumn, in committee and conference, on the record, name by name. Was the timing pushed? Absolutely. Wilson wanted his signature on it before the year turned, and he got his wish on December 23, 1913, signing with 4 gold pens. Rushed at the finish line, documented, passed in secret by an absent Congress, invented. The roll call is public. Anyone repeating the empty chamber story has simply never looked. The same year gives the mythology its favorite coincidence. 1913 also delivered the 16th Amendment, and with it the federal income tax. Same year, same government. Surely the same plan. Here the honest answer is quieter than either slogan. The two measures shared an era, not a blueprint. Both were currents of the progressive wave remaking American government. The amendment had been moving through the states for 4 years before the Fed bill existed. Coincidence in the calendar, yes. A package signed by hidden hands. Nothing in the record supports it. By the following autumn, the machine was staffed and breathing, and running its most powerful engine, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was a familiar face, Benjamin Strong, Ben from the island. The man who had helped sketch the creature in secret now held its beating heart, and he took the job just in time for the world to catch fire, because in the summer of 1914, Europe marched into the war we walked through in Episode 1, War and Credit. The Wheel's oldest pairing, ready for its American debut. The Ledger, documented, exaggerated, invented. Time to open the ledger. 3 columns. Everything this story owes you, accounted for. Column 1, documented. The secret meeting happened. That is not a theory. It is the testimony of the men who were there. Vanderlip confessed it in a mass circulation magazine in 1935. A financial journalist named Bertie Forbes, founder of the magazine that bears his name, had already exposed the outline back in 1916 and was dismissed by many as a fabulist for getting it right. The first names rule, the hunting cover, the 9 days, participant documented, all of it. Documented, too, is the lineage. The Jekyll design, regional reserves, elastic currency, the powerless stock, is visibly the skeleton inside the Federal Reserve Act. The island's fingerprints are on the machine. The men who denied the meeting for 20 years were not protecting nothing. Column 2, exaggerated. The Federal Reserve is a private bank, owned by the bankers. Here is where that strange stock matters. Member banks do hold shares in their regional reserve banks. That part is real. But recall what those shares are. Unsellable, untradeable, dividend-capped, carrying no market for control. The governing board in Washington is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And the system's profits, tens of billions of dollars in a typical year, are remitted to the United States Treasury. A private company whose owners can't sell it, don't control it, and don't keep its profits is not what the word private means to anyone. And yet, the exaggeration grew from something true. The structure is strange. The regional banks are technically corporations. The New York Fed does sit closer to Wall Street than any public agency should sit to anyone. The honest description is a hybrid stranger than either slogan. Too public to be a banker's toy, too entangled to be just another government office. The wealth at the table numbers belong here too. A quarter of the world's wealth, a sixth. These trace back to club promotion and later embroidery, not to any audit. The men were immensely powerful. The arithmetic is decoration. Column 3, invented. In April 1912, the Titanic went down, and with it 3 of the richest men alive. John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus. Decades later, a story surfaced. They were murdered, the ship deliberately sunk, because they opposed the Federal Reserve. The record contains no evidence that any of the 3 was campaigning against the plan. Straus, for what it's worth, had spoken favorably of banking reform. The claim itself appears generations after the sinking, not in 1912, and the timeline collapses on inspection. When the ship sank, the bill that became the Federal Reserve Act did not yet exist. A tragedy recruited decades later as a prop. And the oldest invention of all, the one that ties this episode to our last, that the Fed is owned secretly by European families, by Rothschild. We spent an hour with that family. You know the pattern now. The fabricated quotes invented decades after death. The shareholder list that no one can ever produce because Federal Reserve stock cannot be held by individuals, American or foreign. And underneath it, the old ugly engine, the foreign Jewish banker as puppet master. In 1913, the role was assigned to Paul Warburg by name, the German accent, the family in Hamburg. The same machinery of myth that looted a family in Vienna in 1938, as we saw, was already warming up on this side of the ocean. That is why this channel keeps 3 columns, because the difference between a documented secret and an invented one is not academic. One of them is history, the other has a body count. The creature tested. So the machine existed. The question the next 30 years would answer, did it work? Its first test came instantly. The Great War turned Washington into the largest borrower on Earth and the young Federal Reserve into the engine room of war finance, floating Liberty loans, moving credit on a scale the island's architects had sketched only in theory. The machine held. Through the 1920s, its true center of gravity wasn't Washington at all. It was Ben Strong's New York Fed, the island alumnus running American monetary policy in everything but title, coordinating with London, steering the boom. The 20s gave the machine one ugly rehearsal and one fateful favor. The rehearsal came first. In 1920, the young Fed jacked rates skyward to strangle wartime inflation and triggered a depression so sharp that prices and wages fell off a cliff. Brutal, brief, and largely forgotten because the economy snapped back within 18 months. The machine had proven it could break things on purpose. The favor came in 1927. Europe's currencies were straining, gold was draining toward America, and Strong, ever the internationalist, thick with the Bank of England's Montague Norman, cut rates to ease the pressure abroad. He described the move to a colleague in a phrase that would be quoted at his ghost for a century as giving a little coup de whiskey to the stock market. The market took the whiskey, then it took the bottle. The last wild leg of the great bull market, the margin loans, the shoeshine boy stock tips, the Florida land hysteria's Wall Street echo, ran on cheap money poured with the best intentions by the man from the island. Then, in 1928, Strong died. 1 year later came the reckoning the whole machine had been built for. the crash of 1929. And after the crash, the wave of bank failures, thousands upon thousands of banks, exactly the fire the lender of last resort existed to fight. The fire brigade did not pump. The Federal Reserve, divided, leaderless after strong, wedded to doctrines that said let the rot burn out, allowed the money supply to collapse by roughly a third. The panic-stopping machine presided over the greatest panic in history, and the depression that followed wore the great that 1873 surrendered. That verdict, by the way, is not fringe. It is the judgment of Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's monumental History of American Money, and it was accepted decades later by a Federal Reserve governor named Ben Bernanke, who stood at Friedman's 90th birthday and, speaking for the institution, admitted, "You're right, we did it. We're very sorry." The central bank confessing to the crime it was created to prevent. Now, watch what happens next, because this is the pattern this whole episode has been building toward. The Fed failed, and its punishment was more power. The Banking Act of 1935 rebuilt it, stripping authority from the regional banks and concentrating it in a reconstituted Board of Governors in Washington. Then a Second World War made it the Treasury's financing arm. Then a 1951 accord set it free as an independent power in its own right. Failure, then expansion. Crisis, then more capacity. Each emergency ratcheting the machine larger and none of the ratchets ever turning back. Keep that ratchet in mind. It is the actual secret of Jekyll Island, hiding in plain sight in the daylight record, where the conspiracy theories never think to look. The island the wheel forgot. And what became of the island itself? Fortuna's wheel, it turns out, ground over its own birthplace. Through the 20s, the Jekyll Island Club still glittered. New cottages, new millionaires, the winter address of American money. Then the machine designed in its dining room failed its great test, and the depression that followed did what no reformer ever managed. It thinned the membership rolls. Fortunes that had seemed geological went soft. Dues lapsed. Cottages stood dark. Through seasons their owners once wouldn't have missed for a wedding. The club limped into the next decade, and then the war finished it with a strange cinematic cruelty. In the spring of 1942, German U-boats surfaced off the Georgia coast and began torpedoing tankers within sight of American beaches. The government, unwilling to risk a submarine bagging half the nation's industrial aristocracy in a single raid, saw the island cleared. The 1942 season ended early. The club never opened again. In 1947, the state of Georgia bought the entire island, clubhouse, cottages, moss, ghosts, for a sum that wouldn't have covered one member's yacht in 1910. The most exclusive club in America became a state park. Today you can walk in without a name at all, first or last. The clubhouse is a hotel. The dining room where 7 men sketched your money is a stop on a guided tour, marked with a plaque and photographed by tourists in flip-flops. There is something almost too neat in it. The machine born on the island outgrew the island, outgrew New York, outgrew the gold in its vaults, and the gilded world that built it evaporated like morning fog off the marsh. The Vanderbilts and Astors of that membership book faded exactly the way Episode 1 taught us. Dynasties fade. Institutions, it turns out, are the only dynasty that compounds forever. The wheel and the dollar. pull the camera back and run the century forward. 1944. With the war still burning, delegates from 44 nations gather at a resort hotel in New Hampshire and rebuild the world's money around a single anchor, the American dollar. The system takes its name from the hotel's mountain address, Bretton Woods. Every major currency pegged to the dollar pegged to gold. The machine from Jekyll Island is suddenly the engine of the entire Western world. Hold that hotel in your mind. It is the next island in this series, but we'll come back to that. 1971. President Nixon, facing a run on America's gold, closes the gold window on live television. The dollar's last anchor chain is cut. From that night to this one, the world's money is backed by nothing except judgment. The judgment of the machine's board, meeting 8 times a year behind a marble facade in Washington. Think about what the island's ghosts would make of that. They designed a device to stretch and shrink a gold-backed currency with the seasons. Their heirs steer a currency backed by decision alone. 2008. The machine does things its architects never imagined, conjuring trillions, absorbing the wreckage of Wall Street onto its own books, lending in a single autumn more than the Jekyll men moved in their combined lifetimes. 2020. Larger still and faster. Every ratchet turn arriving, as always, wrapped in an emergency. And every emergency leaving the machine bigger than it found it. And the record demands one more turn, because the machine's ledger holds a triumph as documented as its 1930 disgrace. By the late 1970s, the judgment-backed dollar was failing its first great test. Inflation grinding into double digits, eating wages faster than they could rise, and a country beginning to believe money itself had a leak in it. In 1979, a towering cigar-chewing economist named Paul Volcker took the machine's controls and did the unthinkable. He let interest rates climb past 20% and held them there while the economy screamed. Farmers blockaded the Fed's headquarters with tractors. Builders mailed him sawn 2x4s, lumber from the houses that would never be built. Volcker didn't blink for 3 years. It worked. Inflation broke like a fever, and the decades of stable prices that followed were, in the profession's judgment, largely his monument. The lesson cut both ways, and this channel gives you both edges. The same insulation from voters that let the Fed sleepwalk into the Depression is what let Volcker do the necessary thing no elected official could have survived doing. The machine's independence is not simply good or evil. It is a loaded instrument, and everything depends on whose hands and which decade. Put numbers on that acceleration because the numbers are the story. The men on the island argued over a system to mobilize millions. The 2008 rescue facilities were measured in trillions. The Federal Reserve's own balance sheet swelling past $2 trillion in months, then after 2020 past 8. Sums with no precedent in the history of money, conjured by committee vote, announced in press conferences, absorbed by markets before lunch. And notice who was in the room at each ratchet. In 1944 at Bretton Woods, it was the American delegation dictating terms to a bankrupt world, with the brilliant doomed John Maynard Keynes warning that building the world's money on one nation's currency planted a contradiction at the core of the system. He lost the argument. The contradiction sprouted on schedule, but that, as promised, is the next episode. Today, the clubhouse on Jekyll Island is a museum. Tourists photograph the dining room, there's a plaque, and the sketch from that dining room, 3 revisions and 11 decades later, decides the interest on your mortgage, the yield on your savings, and the value of the bill in your pocket this morning and every morning. What the wheel reveals. In episode 1, we traced a chain. War creates debt, debt creates dependency, dependency creates influence. That chain built a family's empire. This episode adds the next links, and they are American-made. Panic creates delegation. Delegation creates permanence. Watch the chain run. A panic terrifies a democracy. The democracy in its fear hands the money to experts just for the emergency, just this once. The emergency passes. The power never comes back. Not because villains hoard it, because the next panic always arrives before anyone gets around to returning it, and each panic finds the machine already there, already trusted, already the only tool in the drawer. That's why the sinister version of Jekyll Island, hidden owners, secret masters, a family behind the curtain, gets the mechanism exactly backwards. You don't need a puppet master when you have an architecture. The island's real achievement wasn't hiding the Fed's owners. It was designing a structure that would place money permanently one step beyond the reach of the vote and would grow stronger every time the world caught fire. Now the honest turn. Because there is a serious case for that design, and you deserve to hear it straight. The case goes, money one step beyond the vote is the point. Politicians with a printing press eventually use it to win elections, to fund wars, to buy today at tomorrow's expense. History's Museum of Political Money is a chamber of horrors. Wheelbarrows of banknotes in 1920s Germany, currencies dying in a season. On this view, an independent central bank isn't a theft from democracy. It's democracy tying itself to the mast, Ulysses plugging his own ears. And the opposing case answers, then who audits the mast? A committee of unelected experts meeting behind marble made the calls that in 1930 turned a recession into a decade of ruin, and no ballot could touch them. Independence protects the money from the mob. Nothing, its critics say, protects the mob from the experts. Each side, notice, owns one half of the historical record. The independence camp points at Weimar wheelbarrows, at Argentina's cereal collapses, at every treasury that ever discovered the printing press wins elections. Political money, given time, always eats itself. The accountability camp points at 1930, at the third of the money supply that vanished under expert stewardship, at 10 years of soup lines administered by men no voter could remove, and asks the question that never gets a clean answer, an error that large, made by the elected, at least ends at the ballot box. Where does the expert's error end? 110 years on, that argument is not settled. It is not close to settled. It flares up in every crisis, in every election, in every country that copied the model, which by now is nearly all of them. This channel's job was to show you where the machine actually came from. The panic, the train, the 9 days, the ledger of what's real. Where you stand on the machine itself, that seat at the table is yours. The wheel turns again. One last time, stand on that platform in Hoboken. Midnight, November 1910. Blinds drawn, lamps low, 7 powerful men pretending to be duck hunters. They came home 9 days later with no ducks. What they bagged was the 20th century. Everything after flowed through the thing they sketched. The war loans, the roaring 20s, the crash, the depression, the dollar's coronation, the age of money backed by judgment alone. A machine born in secret, confessed in print, mythologized into monsters, and still, this morning, deciding what your money is worth. The wheel that lifted a Frankfurt family over Europe now turned an American machine over the world, and the wheel did not stop there. Because in 1944, in that mountain hotel in New Hampshire, the machine's masters gathered the delegates of 44 battered nations and did something no empire had ever managed with armies. They made the entire world agree to run on one country's money. How they pulled that off, the dying English lord who fought for 3 weeks and still lost, the single buried clause that decided it, and the night in 1971 when America finally broke its own promise. That story is coming later in this series, The Bretton Woods Secret. If you want to be here when the wheel turns, subscribe, and bring a friend who still believes the duck hunt story. This has been Fortuna's Wheel, and the wheel is still turning.